Welcome back, builders. In today's video we're putting a motor on a Stingray. It's a remake, not an OG. These are the new ones you can find at Walmart for about $160 with free shipping. And I want to give a big shout out to LBG for letting me know that they were back in stock during our first audit video. The funny thing about that is in that video I had mentioned how I'd been keeping an eye on the Walmart website for these to come back in stock for over a year, and he took one look and there they were. Although my early days of motorized bike building were all over the place, just seeing what worked and what didn't, lately I build my bikes mostly for practicality and fun. But with the Stingray build, this one I'm just building for fun. I will say, the ape hangers with the laid-back seat make this a pretty comfortable ride. It feels really relaxed. There's not a lot of cushion on that seat for long-range trips, but I don't see any reason why some individuals in certain situations couldn't use this as a daily driver. It doesn't appear to be a weak frame. It's a tight build, but let's go ahead and see what we ran into while trying to put it together. In my 3-star difficulty category, I put this build smack dab in the middle. Being a moderate difficulty, you're probably not going to want to build this as your first motorized bike because some past experience is going to help you a lot. However, there's no specialty tools required or modification of the bike itself. So this entire bike is basically a scaled down version of any beach cruiser you've ever worked on. It's tight. There's not a lot of room. Nearly everything on this bike has been scaled down, including the tubes used to mount the motor. For this reason, I decided to use my CU-Tech, the first motor I ever bought. It has smaller mounting points, which is usually not ideal for most builds, but in this situation it's probably going to help us out. Even so, I found issues getting enough friction between the motor mounts and the frame to keep the motor from migrating left and right. Another issue I ran into is if you flush mount the rear mount, the bottom mount, it sits pretty crooked and could eat into the frame. For this reason, I decided to use 2 layers of heater hose between the motor and the frame. This is not ideal, and I wouldn't recommend doing it on most builds, but in this situation, I couldn't find any other way. I did test fit the motor with the universal mounting plate, and holy crap, is it a tight squeeze, but it does look like it'll work. And comparing this to what I have now, I think I'm going to go ahead and put the mounting plate on the bike. The fitment and contact points does not look like it's going to be very good, but I think it's better than I have it at the moment. Should put less stress on the frame, and I'll be able to keep the pedal chain guard on the bike, which in my opinion looks really sharp. And obviously for the same reason, I can't use a CNC motor mount. There's simply not enough room. So with all that out of the way, I decided just to leave it as is and see if it'll work. Next, we needed a solution for the carburetor because it obviously was not going to fit inside the frame. Now, the original Stingrays might be easier builds. I don't know if they have more room. I've seen a couple individuals with builds, and it looks like they were able to stuff the carburetor inside there. So, check out other people's videos and see what they did to get it to work. Now, I got the idea from Jackie. We featured his build in one of our audit videos, and he just used a piece of heater hose clamped onto the stock intake with a small bit of tubing between the hose and the carburetor. I just so happened to have a piece of tubing that I cut out of our original jog pipe, which was a restrictor or reinforcer, something, I don't know, but it fit almost perfect inside the carburetor. All I had to do was sand it down a little bit, and we got a nice snug fit. Moving on to the only other 2 trouble areas in this build, the first one being the coaster brake arm. On most Huffy Cranbrook frames, I usually don't have to modify the coaster brake arm to get it to clear the bolts for the sprocket, but with this being a tighter, smaller build, I simply had to bend it out and back, make the stock bends a little more aggressive so that it would clear the bolts on the sprocket. Easy fix. Mounting the sprocket to the rear wheel, on the other hand, was a challenge. As it turns out, the spoke pattern on the rear wheel does not line up with the 9-hole pattern on our sprocket. I've dealt with this issue in the past on other bikes, mostly 27.5-inch wheels, but the spoke pattern on these small wheels does not line up even close to the rag joint adapter. As a matter of fact, it wouldn't even line up with a clamp-on hub adapter. However, a hub adapter in this situation would be easier to use if you want to dig into that. My solution for this was to line up the holes in the sprocket with as least interference on the spokes as I could, and then loosen 2 of the spokes, insert all the bolts, center the sprocket, tighten it down, and then re-true the rear wheel. It took a lot of time, trial, and error. But at the end of the day, we made it work with the sprocket pretty true, and since we're going to be using a spring tensioner on this build because a stock chain tensioner probably won't fit, it will take up any added slack or tightening of the chain from an untrue sprocket. For that sprocket, I decided to go with a 32 tooth to give us a better cruising speed on these tiny tires. And that was pretty much it for the build. The only issue I'm currently dealing with is that the chain is rubbing on the rear tire. The rear tire is a wide, slick street tire, which looks pretty cool and would probably perform pretty well in the long run, but it's a little too wide for this setup, and I can't get the chain not to rub on the tire without doing some severe retruing of the rear wheel to move it slightly to the right, which in my opinion is not worth it. So I'm just going to replace this tire with a thinner tire like what's on the front and run it like that. But we're going to have to do that later because I don't have it with me right now. And pretty much everything else on this build worked out great. The tank mounts quite easily. It's not perfect. We did use a bit of double-sided sticky tape underneath to make sure it doesn't move around, but it works. Usually a build video would go a little more in depth, but it was really that simple. Just tight mounting of the motor and the sprocket was a pain, but everything else went together really well, so let's go find out how it rides. Oh man. Yeah, this is ridiculous. Oh, damn pedal running into the chain tensioner. That's annoying. So our first problem is that the pedal runs into one of the bolts on the spring tensioner, which is not a big deal because it just barely touches, so I'll shave that bolt down a little bit to fix that later. And obviously the clutch is slipping. I haven't ridden this motor in a long time, so I think maybe the clutch pad's hardened up. I put a little more tension on the clutch plate by tightening the flower nut 3 notches and then removing the extra slack in the clutch cable. Good old reliable Sutek. First motor I ever bought. Alright, so first impressions of building a gas-powered motorized Stingray. We still have a lot of work to do to this build, but rest assured I'm going to get it dialed in and we're going to take it on a nice adventure ride. So let's knock out the current issues that I'm dealing with before we get on to what I like. Biggest issue that needs to be addressed right away, obviously the chain rubbing on the rear tire, which you can hear in the video. It's quite pronounced. I originally thought it was the half link I used to get the chain length just right, but it only happens under load. It's definitely rubbing on the tire. Second, the rear fenders got to come off for safety. I know the fenders on the Stingrays look great, and I was originally just going to reinforce the mounting points so I could keep them on this bike, but Walmart didn't ship this bike with the front fender for some reason. It just wasn't in the box, so that kind of sucks. Next, I'm going to play around with using the universal adapter on the motor to see if that fits, because I think it's just going to put less stress on the frame. I probably won't bother adding a front brake to this bike, but I might put a front rim brake on it. The stock coaster brake seems to work just fine, and I'm not going to be pushing any high speeds on this bike, just leisurely cruising around, so I think the coaster brake will be okay. A little bit of cable management needs to be done, but that's on pretty much every build. And last, the motor seems to be running a bit lean. I think there's an air leak somewhere, probably the crank seals, because they've never been replaced on this motor as far as I can remember. I don't think there's an air leak with the intake setup. However, the lean running condition might be because of the intake extension. I will try and shorten down this hose as much as I can after I readjust the motor's position to see if I can get it to run a little bit better. It could just be a dirty carburetor. I didn't bother to clean it, but it didn't look like it needed it. This is a Bofang, and you guys know my track record with Bofangs. As long as it doesn't start leaking, I'll use it, but as soon as it starts leaking, I'm swapping it over to an NT Speed. Now on to what I like, and this bike really surprised me the first time I rode it. What was originally just being built just for fun, nothing practical, turns out that this thing is really comfortable to ride. The seat doesn't have very much cushion, so we'll do something about that probably if I'm not lazy, but other than that, the seat position with the high handlebars and laid back design, it makes this thing a joy to ride. It doesn't feel like a tiny bike when you're on it. It maneuvers around really nice. It's flowy. It's just only when you get off the bike you realize how tiny it is. It's literally half the size of a regular cruiser. You pick the whole thing up with one hand and just drag it through the front door. It's like in between a scooter and a bike. I feel like as long as I can conquer any of the little issues with mounting the motor and getting it to run just right, along with the chain clearance, I think I can actually use this as a daily rider to and from work. It might look kind of impractical, but it rides very nice. I think I got lucky choosing the 32-tooth Sprocket, as with me weighing 210 pounds, it still has just enough power if you feather the clutch to get you moving from a dead stop without using the pedals on flat ground, and it cruises really nice. Two things to keep in mind: because this is a laid-back seat design, it puts most of your weight over the rear axle. You're going to want to be careful while accelerating, especially uphill, as you can get that front tire to lift off the ground without really applying much power. There's just not a lot of weight on it. This also means that if you're maneuvering around sketchy situations where you're used to doing it on a regular bike with more of a 50-50 split, just remember most of the weight's on the rear tire, and that might affect the dynamics when steering through gravel and sandy conditions. Also, because most of your weight is on the rear axle, there's a good chance that the axles on these bikes are not going to last very long. They're probably going to bend pretty quick. I'm 210 pounds. I don't expect this axle to last very long. So if you can upgrade them with something strong, try to do that. And I guess one last bonus, which really doesn't matter to me, but it might to you, is surprisingly, after reviewing the 360 footage, I don't look any goofier than I normally do riding a bike. It just looks kind of like it was meant to fit a full-grown adult. I'm 6'4". I don't feel like I'm cramped on this bike at all. It's pretty crazy. I'm really excited about this. Alright, so that's all we got. I'm going to get this thing dialed in, and we're going to take it on a nice long adventure for you guys. It should be a lot of fun. I'll try and schedule it for a day when there's a thunderstorm. A lot of you guys really like that riding through the rain, and personally, in the summer, I love riding in the rain. I hope you guys got some useful information out of today's video, or at the very least were mildly entertained. And until next time, ride safe.